The keys were cold in my hand. Real estate keys. 2 of them on a plain metal ring attached to a document with my name printed at the top in clean black ink. Sloan Merritt, sole beneficiary. I was standing on the front porch of a house in the Kenwood neighborhood of Minneapolis, a 3-story craftsman with oak floors and a wraparound porch that my grandfather had lived in for 40 years. The house Renata had told me more than once would never belong to someone like me. I could hear her voice from 18 years ago, like it was yesterday. "You're not Vincent's real family. You're a leftover from a mistake he made." She'd said it at dinner, in front of everyone. I was 11 years old. My grandfather Clifford heard her say it too. He didn't respond that night. He just reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a small leather notebook, and wrote something down. That was the first entry. There would be hundreds more. But here's what Renata never understood. The man she'd dismissed as a quiet old grandfather had been building a case against her for 15 years. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every time she looked at me and saw a problem to be managed instead of a child who needed protecting. He documented all of it, and then he handed it to me. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Also, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. Now let me take you back to where it all started. I moved into the house on Kenwood Avenue on a Saturday morning in February. Not immediately after the meeting, there were 60 days of logistics of Renata and Vincent finding somewhere else to be, of Garrett managing the formal transfer with the particular, unhurried precision that had characterized everything he did on my grandfather's behalf. I used those 60 days well. I repainted my old bedroom, not to erase it, to reclaim it. A warm white, the color of morning light through north-facing windows, the color I would have chosen at 11 if anyone had asked. Nobody had asked. Now nobody needed to. The moving truck arrived at 8 in the morning. Liam drove the rental. Priya came to help and spent most of the day reorganizing my kitchen with a thoroughness that suggested she had been waiting for this opportunity for years. James brought his wife and their 2 kids, who ran through the hallways with the particular joy of children in a house that has good bones and high ceilings and a staircase worth sliding down. I stood in the living room doorway and watched them and felt something I didn't have an immediate word for, something that lived between gratitude and grief and the particular ache of arriving somewhere you should have been all along. On the mantel where Renata's landscape print had hung for 14 years, I placed my mother's photograph. The large one, Caroline Merritt, at 32, standing in the backyard of this very house in the garden. She had planted herself, laughing at whoever was behind the camera, sunlight in her hair, dirt on her knees. I hung it level. I stepped back and looked at it. There, I thought. Finally there! The house required work, not structural. Grandpa Clifford had maintained it with the same methodical care he brought to everything but the kind of work that comes from a space having been occupied by the wrong people for too long. Renata's taste was everywhere in the pendant lights and the marble countertops and the gallery wall of landscapes that had replaced every photograph of anyone who mattered. I took it slowly, one room at a time, one decision at a time. I kept what was worth, keeping the built-in bookshelves in the study that Grandpa Clifford had installed in the 1980s, the wide plank oak floors that had been there since my father was a child, the wraparound porch where I had sat on summer evenings as a girl and watched the neighborhood go quiet. I replaced what needed replacing, not in reaction to Renata, in response to myself. To the person I had become over 29 years of building a life in the margins of someone else's arrangement. Liam had opinions about the kitchen, good ones as it turned out. We argued pleasantly about cabinet hardware for 3 weeks and reached a compromise that was better than either of our original positions. I had come to understand the particular quality of a good partnership. The outcome is consistently better than what either person would have arrived at alone, he proposed in the study. Not with elaborate staging, just one evening in early spring, the 2 of us at the desk, going over drawings for a project. I was bidding on the room, smelling like coffee and old books. He set a small box on top of my site plans. I looked at it then at him. "I've been carrying that for 4 months, he said. I kept waiting for the right moment, and then I realized the right moment is just any moment that's honest. I opened the box. "Yes," I said before he could say another word. "Obviously, yes," he laughed. I laughed. The oak floors creaked in the way they always had, and the study smelled like coffee. And outside the window, the oak tree in the front yard was doing what oak trees do in April in Minneapolis, slowly, deliberately committing to the season. Vincent called the following Sunday. He had been calling every Sunday for 4 months by then, not the careful, abbreviated calls of before, but longer ones with more silence in them, the silence of a man learning to sit with discomfort instead of filling it with deflection. He had been seeing a therapist, a woman in St. Paul, whose name he had mentioned twice, whose methodology he described with the slightly stunned quality of someone encountering honesty for the first time and finding it unexpectedly survivable. I told him about the engagement. He was quiet for a moment. Then his voice did something I hadn't heard since I was very young. It broke. Not dramatically, just at the edges the way old wood gives, slightly under pressure, without failing entirely. "I'm happy for you, Sloane," he said. "I'm so glad." "Thank you, Dad." He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about the awards ceremony. When you were 14, the design competition." I said nothing. I let him continue. "Your grandfather told me about it years later, but he told me he was the only one there, that he stood up alone in a seated crowd." His voice was careful, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing each word with the full weight of its meaning. "I've thought about that image almost every day for the past 4 months. You walking across that stage, him standing up alone." "He was enough," I said. "He was more than enough." "I know," Vincent said. "I know he was. I should have been there too." The Sunday afternoon light was falling through the study windows, long and amber, the particular light of a season changing. I sat with what he'd said for a moment. "You're here now," I said finally. "That's not nothing. It wasn't forgiveness complete and unconditional. I wasn't sure that was what either of us needed. What it was accurate and honest accounting of where we stood and what was possible from here, if we were both willing to do the work of getting there." He was willing. Slowly, imperfectly, 20 years too late, he was willing. That was something I was choosing to accept as a beginning. Renata and Vincent had separated 3 months after the meeting at Garrett's office. I heard this from Patricia Hale, Vincent's aunt, who had become something unexpected in the months since the reading. A steady, warm presence in my life. A woman who had known my mother and who spoke about her with the easy affection of someone who had genuinely loved her. She called every few weeks. She sent flowers when I moved into the house. I realized the family I had always been adjacent to without ever quite being allowed inside. Renata had moved to Chicago, where Cassidy was living. I had no further information about this and sought none. Cassidy had emailed once a long email, carefully written, that acknowledged without excusing and apologized without performing. It was the most honest communication I had ever received from her. I read it 3 times. I wrote back a single paragraph. Not warm exactly, but not closed. A door left slightly open, not because I was certain she deserved it, but because certainty had never been the standard I held things to. Possibility was enough. Preston had not contacted me. I did not expect him to. Some people find their way to accountability, and some people don't, and it is not your job to wait by the door for them to decide. I read Grandpa Clifford's letter once more on the evening of the day we moved in, sitting on the porch steps, as the light went down the neighborhood, settling into its evening sounds. The oak tree doing its slow and patient work above me. The house is just wood and walls. But it's your wood and your walls. It always was. I folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands. He had spent 15 years watching, documenting, preparing the ground with the patience of a man who understood that justice sometimes requires a very long runway. He never got to see me walk through this door with my own keys, but he knew I would. He said so. He wrote it down. "Knowing you, I'm certain you will." The evening was cold and clear and entirely honest, the kind of night Minneapolis makes in February when it has nothing to apologize for and knows it. Liam came and sat beside me on the porch steps, close enough that our shoulders touched, and handed me a mug of tea without a word. We sat there as the last light went. I was 29 years old. I was sitting on the porch of a house that had always been mine, beside a person who had chosen me fully and without reservation, holding a letter from a man who had seen me clearly from the beginning. I was not invisible. I had never been invisible. I had simply been waiting for the ground to be prepared. It was ready now. You don't need everyone to see your worth. You just need one person who refuses to look away. And if no one does, you can be that person for yourself, because your value was never determined by who acknowledged it. It was always yours. It always was. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to set a boundary with family? How did it change your life? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, check out the video in the description. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it. My mother's name was Caroline. She died on a Wednesday morning in early April when I was 11 years old. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end, it was 7 months. 7 months of watching someone you love disappear in slow motion. First, the weight, then the hair, then the voice, then the light behind her eyes. I held her hand the night she passed. My father, Vincent, sat on the other side of the hospital bed, staring at the floor. He didn't cry. Not once. Not that I saw. I thought that was grief. I was 11. I didn't know yet that some people don't grieve. They simply move on to the next arrangement. 8 months after my mother's funeral, Vincent Merritt brought Renata Voss home for dinner. I remember that dinner the way you remember a car accident. Not the details exactly, the color of her blouse, the brand of wine she brought, but the feeling. The particular wrongness of it. The way the air in our house on Kenwood Avenue shifted the moment she walked through the door like a pressure change before a storm. Renata was 41 years old. She had cheekbones like architecture and a way of entering a room that suggested she'd already assessed it and found it acceptable. Behind her came 2 children, Cassidy, 13, and Preston, 15, both of them wearing the particular expression of kids who have been brought to enough of these dinners to know how to perform. Vincent introduced them with a warmth I hadn't heard from him in months. "This is Renata, and these are her kids Cassidy and Preston." Then he looked at me almost as an afterthought. "And this is Sloane." That was it. No descriptor, no warmth, just a name offered like a footnote. Renata looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. Then she smiled, polished, precise. The smile of a woman who had already decided something and turned back to Vincent. "She looks just like Caroline," she said softly. It was meant to sound kind. It wasn't. The seating arrangement at that first dinner told me everything I needed to know. Renata sat to Vincent's left. Cassidy and Preston flanked him on the right, close angled toward him like satellites finding their orbit. I was placed at the far end of the table nearest the kitchen doorway, the seat you give a guest you're not sure about or a child you've already categorized. I ate my pasta and watched. Renata touched Vincent's arm when she laughed. She asked Preston about his baseball season with the focus of someone who had memorized the details specifically to deploy them here. She cut Cassidy's bread for her. Cassidy was 13, fully capable of cutting her own bread, and did it with a tenderness so practiced it looked almost real. She did not ask me a single question, not one. Not my grade in school, not my favorite subject, not whether I'd eaten enough. For the entire dinner, I was as present and as invisible as the chair I sat in. Grandpa Clifford arrived for dessert. He lived 20 minutes away in the same craftsman house on Kenwood he'd owned since before my father was born. He walked in with a pie from the bakery on Lake Street and stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the new woman, the new children, his granddaughter at the far end of the table. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. I looked back. He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. Renata and Vincent were married 11 months later. A small ceremony, 40 guests at a venue in the North Loop. I wore a dress my aunt had bought me because Vincent had forgotten to arrange it. I stood in the back row of the family photos and was cropped out of the one that made it onto their mantle. I noticed. I didn't say anything. That was the first lesson Renata's household taught me. Noticing was permitted. Speaking was not. The changes came gradually the way water damage comes. You don't see it happening. You just look up one day and the ceiling is different. Within 6 months of the wedding, my mother's photographs had been removed from the living room. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious even for Renata. First, the large one above the fireplace, replaced with a landscape print Renata called more neutral. Then the one on the bookshelf. Then the small framed photo on the hallway table that I passed every morning on the way to school. I moved them to my bedroom. Every single one. Renata never acknowledged it. She didn't need to. The message had already been received. The house on Kenwood Avenue had 4 bedrooms. Mine was the smallest, the one at the end of the hall, with the single window that faced the neighbor's fence. I had lived in it since I was 3 years old. I knew every sound it made, every draft, the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard near the closet. The week after the wedding, Renata had Cassidy's room professionally redecorated. New bed frame, upholstered headboard, the kind of string lights that cascade down a wall like a waterfall, a custom desk with built-in shelving, a rug from a boutique on Hennepin Avenue that I later looked up $380. My room stayed exactly as it was. I told myself it didn't matter. I almost believed it. What I couldn't rationalize away was what happened at the family dinner 6 weeks after the wedding, the night 12 relatives gathered at our house for Vincent's birthday. The night Renata stood at the head of the table where my mother used to stand, raised her glass, and gave a toast about our family finally whole. She looked at Cassidy when she said it. She looked at Preston. She looked at Vincent. Then someone asked her to introduce the children, and she did. Cassidy, my youngest, and Preston, my son, and smiled at the room with the confidence of a woman who had already rewritten the story and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. I was sitting 4 feet away. My grandfather, Clifford, was sitting in the corner, and in the breast pocket of his jacket, his hand moved. I didn't know what he was writing. Not yet. But I didn't know it then that quiet Tuesday night was only the beginning of what Renata was capable of. The worst of it hadn't even started. Let me tell you about the architecture program. I was 12 years old when I discovered I could draw buildings, not sketch them the way kids doodle actually draw them. Floor plans, elevations, the way light would fall through a window at a specific angle in a specific season. My art teacher, Mrs. Henriksen, pulled me aside after class one afternoon and said, "Sloan, this is a real gift. You should develop it." It was the first time an adult outside of my grandfather had said something like that to me. I went home and told Vincent. He looked up from his laptop, nodded once, and said, "That's nice." Renata, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a glass of white wine, said nothing. But the following week, she enrolled Cassidy in a private art class at a studio on Grand Avenue, $60 per session twice a week. Cassidy had never expressed any interest in art. She attended 4 sessions and quit. The studio invoice went on the family credit card. My gift was nice. Cassidy's indifference was worth $480. I stopped mentioning things I was good at after that. The first time I understood that money in our household had a direction, I was 13. My school offered a summer design intensive 2 weeks at the University of Minnesota campus, working with architecture students on real project briefs. The cost was $800. I had researched it for 3 weeks before I asked. I had printed the brochure. I had highlighted the line that said, "Merit-based scholarships available for qualifying students." I set it on the kitchen table in front of Vincent on a Saturday morning. He read it. He looked at Renata. Renata picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. "We can't justify that kind of expense for a hobby," she said. Her voice was perfectly reasonable, the tone of someone making a sensible financial decision. "You're 13. You don't even know what you want to do yet." "It's not a hobby," I said. Mrs. Henriksen said, "I'm sure she did." Renata smiled. "But we have to think about what's practical." Vincent said nothing. That same week, Renata purchased a full oil painting set for Cassidy. Brushes, canvases, a wooden easel that stood 5 feet tall. The receipt I accidentally saw on the counter. I wasn't looking for it, it was just the red, $1,940. Cassidy set it up in her room, painted one canvas, a crooked sun, over a blue hill, and never touched it again. The easel is probably still there. What Renata did publicly was bad enough. What she did privately was something else entirely. She had a way of speaking about me to other adults that I only fully understood in retrospect when I was old enough to decode the language. At neighborhood gatherings at school, functions at the dinners she hosted for Vincent's colleagues, she would refer to me with a particular careful phrasing. Not cruelty. Phrasing. Sloan is very independent, she always has been. She's not really a people person. She prefers to keep to herself. "We try, but she's always been a little resistant to the family dynamic," said with a soft smile, said with the tone of a devoted stepmother doing her best with a difficult situation, said in front of people who had no reason to question it, who nodded sympathetically and looked at me sideways for the rest of the evening. I was 13. I didn't have the vocabulary for what she was doing. Now I do. She was building a file. Not in a notebook the way Grandpa Clifford did, but in the minds of every adult around us, preemptively, carefully, so that if I ever said anything, the story was already written. Sloane's always been difficult. You know how she is. Preston was the delivery mechanism. 3 years older than me, 17 to my 14. He had inherited his mother's talent for precision cruelty. He never hit, never screamed, never did anything that left a mark an adult could point to. He borrowed things without asking and returned them broken. He walked into rooms I was studying in and turned on the television at full volume. He told his friends loudly within my earshot that his stepsister was basically a ghost. She just kind of haunts the house. His friends thought it was funny. I ate dinner faster so I could leave the table before he arrived. The school awards ceremony. I was 14. I had won the regional design competition, a citywide contest for middle school students, judged by a panel from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. First place. My project was a redesign of a community library branch in North Minneapolis with detailed floor plans and a written rationale. The judges called it exceptionally mature for a student of this age. The ceremony was on a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. I had given Vincent the date 6 weeks in advance. I had reminded him twice once, 2 weeks out once the day before. He wasn't there. Renata had organized a dinner that night for Cassidy's volleyball team. 12 girls catered from a restaurant on Nicollet Avenue. Cassidy's team had finished the season third from the bottom of their division. I walked across the stage alone, accepted the certificate from a woman in a blazer who shook my hand and said, "Your work is remarkable, young lady." I looked out at the auditorium. 200 seats, parents with phones raised, grandparents with flowers. My grandfather Clifford was in the fourth row center section. He stood up when I reached the podium, just him, alone in his gray wool coat, standing in a seated crowd, clapping with the deliberate steadiness of a man making a point. After the ceremony, he took me to the diner on Lake Street. He ordered coffee. I ordered hot chocolate. He set the certificate flat on the table between us and looked at it for a long moment. "You did this," he said. "Nobody helped you, nobody paid for a class or bought you an easel. You did this by yourself." I didn't know what to say. "I want you to remember that," he said. "The way it feels right now sitting here. Remember it exactly." He reached into his breast pocket. He wrote something in the small leather notebook, a date, I think, and a few words. He didn't show me what it said. He put the notebook away and picked up his coffee. "How's the hot chocolate?" he asked. "Good," I said. We sat there until the diner closed. I told myself the award ceremony was a one-time thing, a scheduling conflict, an oversight. Then my 8th grade graduation came and went, with Vincent arriving 20 minutes after the ceremony ended. Traffic on 35 W.E. does I'm sorry, kid. While Renata was photographed that same afternoon at Cassidy's end-of-year volleyball banquet corsage, on her wrist, beaming in the front row. I kept the graduation program, folded it small and put it in the box under my bed, where I kept the things that mattered. My mother's photograph, the design competition certificate, a birthday card from Grandpa Clifford with $20 tucked inside, and a note that said, "For something that's just for you." The box got heavier every year. I didn't know it then, but Grandpa Clifford was keeping his own record. And unlike mine, his was going to matter. The worst part wasn't what had already happened. The worst part was what I was about to find out, something Renata had done in the dark years before I was old enough to look. My mother had left me money. I didn't know this until I was 17. And the way I found out wasn't from Vincent, wasn't from a lawyer, wasn't from any of the people who should have told me years earlier. I found out because I was homesick from school on a Thursday afternoon, lying on the couch with a fever, and Renata left her laptop open on the kitchen counter when she went to the grocery store. I wasn't looking for anything. I was getting a glass of water. The screen was open to an email thread. The subject line read, "Re-Merit Trust Quarterly Statement." I stood at that counter for a long time. My fever was 101 degrees. My hands were cold. I read the email 3 times, then 4. Then I put the glass down and went back to the couch and lay there staring at the ceiling until Renata came home. I didn't say anything. I didn't know yet what I had seen, but I remembered every word. That evening I called Grandpa Clifford. He listened without interrupting. That was one of the things about Clifford Merritt. He had a lawyer's patience. He let you finish. He let the silence sit before he spoke into it. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Your mother set up a trust for you," he said. "She did it 8 months before she passed. $45,000. It was meant for your education." I sat on the edge of my bed. "Does Dad know?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "Your father is the trustee," he said. I didn't fully understand what that meant at 17. I understood enough. Vincent controlled the money. Vincent, who deferred to Renata in everything from dinner reservations to which child's volleyball banquet was worth attending. Vincent controlled the money my mother had left specifically for me. "How much is left?" I asked. Grandpa Clifford's voice was careful. "I'm going to find out," he said. "Don't ask your father yet. Don't ask Renata. Don't say anything at all. Can you do that?" I said yes. 3 weeks later, he called me back. The trust account balance was $8,900. My mother had left $45,000. Over 6 years, $36,100 had been withdrawn in small increments, never enough in a single transaction to look alarming. Quarterly distributions, the statements called them. Authorized by the trustee, authorized by Vincent, spent Grandpa Clifford, believed by Renata. He couldn't prove it yet, but he was going to. "I want you to do something for me," he said. "I want you to go to the University of Minnesota. I will pay for every dollar of it. Not from the trust, from my own account. Your mother's money should have been yours. Since it wasn't mine, will be." I started crying. Not loudly, I was 17, and had spent 6 years learning to be quiet, but I was crying, and he could hear it. "Sloan," his voice was firm, but gentle. "Listen to me. You are going to be an architect. You are going to build things that last longer than the people who underestimated you. And when the time is right, everything else will be handled. Do you trust me?" I said yes. I meant it completely. Senior year of high school. I was 18. I was accepted into the architecture program at the University of Minnesota with a partial merit scholarship, based entirely on my portfolio, which I had built over 4 years, with no classes, no easel, no private studio on Grand Avenue. Just my bedroom desk, graph paper I bought with babysitting money, and the particular stubbornness of a girl who had learned that no one was going to make space for her, so she'd better make it herself. The acceptance letter arrived on a Saturday in March. I brought it downstairs. Vincent was at the kitchen table. Renata was beside him reading something on her phone. Cassidy was on the couch. Preston was nowhere I could see. I set the letter on the table. Vincent read it. His face did something complicated, a flicker of something that might have been pride, followed immediately by a sideways glance at Renata. Renata picked up the letter, read it, set it down. "So you're staying in Minneapolis," she said. "Not congratulations, not I'm proud of you. Not even a question about the program or the scholarship or what I wanted to do with it. So you're staying in Minneapolis?" As if the most notable thing about my acceptance to one of the top architecture programs in the Midwest was its geographical inconvenience to her. Vincent said, "That's great, Sloan." He said it the way you'd say, "The weather looks fine," accurate, unremarkable, requiring no further engagement. Cassidy looked up from the couch. "Cool," she said, and went back to her phone. I picked up the letter, folded it back into the envelope, and went upstairs. That afternoon, I called Grandpa Clifford. He answered on the first ring. I read him the letter out loud, every word from the letterhead to the signature at the bottom. When I finished, he was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, I knew it since you were 12 years old." We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his own years at law school, the professors who believed in him and the ones who didn't, the cases that taught him what justice actually looked like up close. He told me about my grandmother who had died before I was old enough to remember her, a woman who he said would have recognized me immediately. "She had your kind of patience," he said. "The kind that isn't passive, the kind that's actually strategy." Before we hung up, he said something I've carried with me every day since. "I've been paying attention, Sloan, to everything. Someone has to." I didn't ask him what he meant. There was something in his tone, settled, deliberate, that told me the answer would come when it needed to. The summer before I left for university, something happened that I didn't understand until years later. Renata began what I can only describe as a quiet campaign. It was subtle enough that I might have dismissed it entirely if I hadn't spent 6 years learning to read her silences as carefully as her words. She started mentioning in front of extended family that the house on Kenwood Avenue was really Vincent's legacy, something to preserve for the right people. She said it twice at a 4th of July gathering, once in the context of Grandpa Clifford's property, once in the context of Vincent's retirement plans. Each time she made brief eye contact with Preston. Preston was 21 that summer. Unemployed, living at home, driving a car Renata had bought him 11 months earlier, a decision made over a single dinner conversation that I had not been invited to. I filed it away, the way I filed everything. I left for the University of Minnesota in late August. I packed my box, my mother's photograph, the design certificates, the birthday cards from Grandpa Clifford. I carried it out the front door of the house on Kenwood Avenue and put it in the back seat of the used Honda I'd bought with 2 years of babysitting and tutoring money. Renata stood in the doorway. She raised her hand in a brief wave. The wave you give a departing acquaintance, not a child leaving home. Vincent hugged me. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn my entire life. "Take care of yourself," he said. I drove to my dorm without looking in the rearview mirror. Grandpa Clifford had slipped a card under my door the night before I left. Inside, in his careful handwriting, were 4 words. "Your time is coming." I taped it to the wall above my desk. It stayed there for 4 years. 4 years at the University of Minnesota passed the way good years do quickly, and with the particular texture of a life finally being lived on its own terms. I graduated with honors. My thesis project, a mixed-use community center designed for an underserved neighborhood in North Minneapolis, with integrated green space and a rooftop learning garden, was selected for the university's annual showcase. 3 faculty members I respected deeply shook my hand afterward and used words like rigorous and humane and exactly what architecture should be doing. I accepted a position at Harlow & Associates, a mid-sized firm in downtown Minneapolis, known for civic and cultural projects. Starting salary $62,000 a year. My own desk, my name on the door badge. A project team that asked my opinion in meetings and then actually used it. I called Grandpa Clifford from the parking garage after I signed the offer letter. "Harlow," he said, and I could hear the smile in it. "Good firm, good people. You'll do well there." "I haven't told Dad yet," I said. A beat of silence. "You don't have to," he said. "But you can if you want to." I told Vincent by text. He replied 2 hours later with, "Congrats, proud of you." Renata didn't respond at all. I hadn't expected her to. The first 2 years at Harlow were the quietest of my adult life in the best possible way. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in the North Loop, 3rd floor, east-facing windows, morning light that fell across the drafting table I'd set up by the wall. I bought furniture slowly, 1 piece at a time, each one chosen, because I actually wanted it, not because it was what someone else had decided I deserved. I had friends for the first time in my life. Real ones, people who knew me without knowing my family, who had no context for the girl who sat at the end of the table nearest the kitchen doorway. My closest friend was a structural engineer named Priya, who laughed too loudly at her own jokes and brought homemade food to the office every Friday without fail. My colleague James, 10 years my senior, became something like an older brother, the kind who gave honest feedback on your drawings and also told you when you had spinach in your teeth. And there was Liam Okafor. We met at a design symposium in the spring of my 2nd year at Harlow. He was a landscape architect, thoughtful and unhurried, with the particular quality of a person who listens to understand rather than to respond. He asked me about my thesis project on our first date. Not as small talk, he had actually looked it up beforehand. He had questions about the rooftop learning garden, specific ones. I talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He didn't check his phone once. 6 months later, he had a key to my apartment. Life for the first time felt like something I had actually built, rather than survived. Then Vincent had his heart attack. It was a mild one that was the word the hospital used, mild, as if cardiac events came in convenient gradations of severity. He was 61 years old. He was in the hospital for 4 days, then home for 3 weeks of monitored rest. Renata called me the morning after it happened. She had never called me first before, ever. In 29 years of shared existence, the call had always gone the other direction, me to her, or me to Vincent, or a text chain that she occasionally acknowledged with a single word. This time she called me. First ring 7:45 in the morning. "Your father needs family around him," she said. Her voice had its usual composure, but there was something underneath it. Not softness exactly, more like recalibration. The tone of a woman adjusting her strategy. "I think it would be good for him to see you." I drove to Kenwood Avenue that weekend. The house looked the same from the outside. The craftsman facade, the oak in the front yard I used to climb as a child, the porch light that had been the wrong wattage for as long as I could remember. Inside, things had shifted in the way houses shift when their inhabitants have been living in them unchallenged for a long time. Renata's taste had absorbed every surface, every corner, until almost nothing remained of the house I had grown up in. My mother's kitchen had been renovated, white marble countertops, pendant lights Renata had selected from a boutique on Hennepin, a coffee machine that cost more than my first month's rent. The wall where my father used to hang family photographs was a gallery of Renata's choosing. Cassidy's college graduation, Preston. At some beach, I didn't recognize a large canvas print of a Tuscany landscape from the trip they'd taken 2 years ago that I had heard about through Vincent's occasional texts. There was one photograph of me, small in a frame I didn't recognize on the bottom shelf of the bookcase near the window. My university graduation photo, the one I had mailed to Vincent because he hadn't been there for the ceremony. Renata had framed it technically. She had placed it in the room technically. It faced the wall at a slight angle as though it had been nudged there by accident and no one had bothered to straighten it. I straightened it. Then I went to check on my father. Vincent looked smaller than I remembered. That was the thing that struck me, not the hospital pallor, not the careful way he moved, but the sheer reduction of him. He had always been a tall man, broad-shouldered, the physical presence of someone accustomed to filling a room. In the chair by the bedroom window, wrapped in a blanket Renata had arranged with decorative precision, he looked diminished. He looked at me when I came in. Something crossed his face, relief maybe, or something adjacent to it. "Hey, kid," he said. I sat in the chair across from him. "How are you feeling?" "Old," he said. Then after a moment, "It's good to see you." I believed him. That was the complicated thing about Vincent Merritt. I always believed that he meant it when he said he was glad to see me. The problem was never his love. The problem was his silence. His extraordinary, consistent 18-year silence in the face of everything his wife had said and done and taken. Loving someone and refusing to protect them is its own particular betrayal. I had understood that intellectually for years. Sitting across from him now, I felt it differently, not as anger, but as a kind of exhausted clarity. I stayed 3 days. The division of labor Renata established was immediate and precise. Cassidy, who had driven up from Chicago where she was living on an allowance Vincent had been sending monthly for the past 3 years, was assigned the role of emotional support. This meant sitting beside Vincent's chair, scrolling through her phone, occasionally patting his hand and being photographed doing so by Renata, for what I assumed was some future deployment on social media. Preston, who was 31 and had been between jobs the 3rd time in 4 years for the past 6 months, was tasked with managing communications. This meant making one phone call to the insurance company, leaving the paperwork on the kitchen counter, and disappearing for the remainder of the afternoon. I cooked. 3 meals a day, every day from scratch, because Vincent's doctor had been specific about sodium and portion sizes, and Renata had responded to this information by purchasing a collection of low-sodium cookbooks she left stacked on the counter without opening. I drove to the pharmacy. I managed the medication schedule. I changed the bed linens on day 2 when Vincent mentioned his back was sore. On the evening of the 2nd day, I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard Renata in the hallway on the phone with someone I didn't know. Her voice was low, practiced. "When Vincent's gone, this house goes to us. The other one has no claim here. None." I stood at the sink. The water was still running. I turned it off. I stood in the sudden quiet of that kitchen, my mother's kitchen, the kitchen Caroline Merritt had chosen every tile of, and I held very still. Something inside me went quiet in a way I had never felt before. Not sad, not angry, just finished. I didn't move for a long time. I just stood there, dish towel in my hand, and let the words settle into the part of me that had been collecting them for 18 years. The other one has no claim here. None. I was 29 years old. I had cooked every meal in this house for 3 days, and I was the other one. I dried my hands. I folded the dish towel and placed it on the counter. I walked quietly down the hallway to my childhood bedroom, the smallest room, the one that faced the neighbor's fence, and I sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark. And for the first time in my life, I didn't try to talk myself out of what I was feeling. I just felt it. All of it. Vincent recovered enough by the 3rd week to sit at the dinner table. Renata marked the occasion by inviting people over. Not just family friends of hers, couples from the neighborhood. Vincent's former colleague, Roger, and his wife, a woman named Patricia, who had been Renata's closest friend for 15 years, and who had never in all the times I had been in the same room as her, directed a complete sentence at me. 12 people total. A celebration of Vincent's recovery, Renata called it. A dinner party catered from a restaurant on Nicollet Avenue. White tablecloths, the good china that lived in the cabinet, Renata had installed the 2nd year of her marriage. She had planned it while I was driving to the pharmacy. I found out about it the morning of when I came downstairs at 7 and found a catering delivery already stacked on the kitchen counter. "I thought it would lift his spirits," Renata said without looking up from her phone. "He needs to feel surrounded by people who love him." I stood in the doorway. She was right, technically. Vincent did need that. The problem was the architecture of who counted as those people in Renata's version of the world. The evening assembled itself with the particular efficiency of a Renata production. By 6 o'clock, the house smelled like catered salmon and the candles she had arranged down the center of the dining table. Guests arrived in pairs, shedding coats, exclaiming over Vincent's color, telling him he looked wonderful. He did look better, more present, more like himself, and watching him receive their warmth. I felt something genuine and uncomplicated. I was glad he was recovering. Whatever else was true, that was true. I had dressed carefully. I had dark trousers, a simple blouse. The pearl earrings my mother had left me that I kept in the small jewelry box on my dresser, and wore only when I needed to feel like she was nearby. I had helped set the table that afternoon. I had arranged the flowers Renata had ordered into the vases she had left sitting empty on the counter, because the task had apparently been allocated to no one. I sat down to dinner between Roger's wife and a neighbor I had met twice before. The conversation flowed around me in the way conversations do at dinner parties, easy, warm, punctuated by laughter. I participated when spoken to. I asked questions. I was by any observable measure present. Renata stood at the head of the table at 8 o'clock and raised her glass. This was her moment. I recognized the posture, the particular straightening of the spine, the breath drawn, just before speaking, the scan of the room to confirm she had it. She had it. "I want to say a few words," she began, "about what this past month has meant to our family." The table settled. Glasses were held. Vincent looked up at her from his chair, and his expression open, grateful entirely. Trusting was one of the hardest things I had looked at in recent memory. "Through this difficult time," Renata continued, her voice perfectly modulated, warm, without being excessive, "my children have been my rock." She looked at Cassidy. Cassidy, who had spent the majority of the past 3 days on her phone, smiled back with the practiced emotion of someone who had been in this spotlight before and knew exactly how to stand in it. She looked at Preston. Preston lifted his chin in a small nod, the gesture of a man receiving credit he had not earned, but had long since stopped questioning his right to. "They stepped up when it mattered," Renata said. "They showed up, and I am so grateful." Applause from the table, warm, genuine, directed at Cassidy and Preston, who received it graciously. Then Renata looked at me. The pause was less than a second. Most people wouldn't have caught it. I caught it. And of course some others helped out as well. Some others, not my name, not a look that lasted long enough to constitute acknowledgement. Just some others, the grammatical equivalent of furniture, of leftover, of the other one with no claim here, none. The table moved on immediately. Someone made a toast. Glasses touched. The salmon was served. Roger's wife turned to me and said something about the centerpiece. I answered her. I don't remember what I said. I was still inside that pause, that fraction of a second in which Renata had looked at me, calculated the cost of my name in her mouth, and decided it wasn't worth paying. 18 years, 3 days of cooking. The pharmacy runs the medication schedule. The bed linens, the flowers arranged in the vases she had left sitting empty. Some others helped out as well. Cassidy pulled out her phone after dessert. "Family photo," she announced already, moving around the table, already organizing. This was Cassidy's particular talent, the curation of the record, the construction of the version of events that would exist in photographs long after the evening itself was forgotten. She arranged Vincent in the center, Renata to his left hand on his shoulder, Preston to his right, broad and present, then herself, angling in beside Renata. Phone extended. She looked at me across the table. "You're kind of blocking the light," she said. "Not come join us. Not get in here. Just a flat practical assessment. You're an obstacle to the image I am constructing. Adjust accordingly." Preston laughed. A short sound, reflexive like a muscle memory. The camera clicked. I looked at the image on Cassidy's screen as she reviewed it. 4 people, a family by the evidence of the photograph, a recovered man and the wife and children who had supported him. I was not in it. I set my napkin on the table, folded it the way I had been taught, corners aligned once, then once again. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I untied the apron I had been wearing since 4 o'clock, the one I had found hanging on the hook by the pantry, because it was the only one in the house, and I had been the only one using it. I folded it over the back of the chair. I went upstairs. I packed my bag. It took 4 minutes. I had never fully unpacked. I carried it down the stairs quietly past the dining room where the conversation had already resumed, past the good china and the white tablecloths and the catered salmon and the 12 people who had watched Renata erase me from the record one more time without blinking. I set my house key on the console table by the front door. I walked out. The night air was cold. October in Minneapolis, the particular cold that has intention in it, that means what it says. I sat in my car in the driveway for a moment without starting the engine. The dining room window glowed yellow. Inside shapes moved. Laughter reached me, muffled through the glass. I looked at the house my mother had chosen. The kitchen she had tiled herself one Saturday afternoon when Vincent was traveling and she had decided not to wait for anyone to help her. The oak tree in the front yard that I had climbed at 7 years old and scraped both knees on the way down, and she had cleaned the scrapes at the kitchen sink and said, "You climbed it though, remember that part?" I started the engine. I drove to my apartment in the North Loop without the radio on. 31 minutes. Every stoplight, every turn completely deliberate the way you drive when something inside you has shifted, and you're treating yourself carefully the way you'd carry something fragile across a room. Liam was home. He opened the door and looked at my face and didn't ask a single question. He just stepped back to let me in, put the kettle on and sat across from me at the kitchen table while I told him everything. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm not going back. Not like that. Not ever again." He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't offer a counter perspective or a reason to reconsider or a suggestion that maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. He just said, "Okay." I held that word for a long time. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known sitting in that kitchen with my hands around a mug of tea, was that 3 days earlier on the morning I had arrived at Kenwood Avenue with groceries and good intentions, Grandpa Clifford had placed a call to his attorney. He had already made his move, and there was no going back. 3 years passed. I want to be careful about how I describe them because they were not 3 years of waiting. They were not 3 years of anger or planning or nursing a wound in the dark. They were 3 years of building, quietly, deliberately, the way you build anything that's meant to last one decision at a time, one day at a time, without asking anyone's permission. I stayed at Harlow and Associates. I was promoted twice first to project architect 18 months in, then to senior associate the following spring. The second promotion came with a salary that made my 22-year-old self, the one who had bought furniture, one piece at a time, with careful intention, feel something close to disbelief. I sat with the offer letter for a full day before I signed it. Not because I was unsure, because I wanted to feel it properly. The weight of something earned entirely by your own hands is different from any other kind of weight. I wanted to know exactly what it felt like. My project portfolio grew. A branch library in South Minneapolis, the same neighborhood my university thesis had imagined redesigning, that won a regional design award from the American Institute of Architects. A community health center in St. Paul that a local paper called a rare example of civic architecture that actually listens to the people it serves. A mixed-use development in the Seward neighborhood that my project team had fought for 18 months to get approved, and that I walked through on the day it opened, touching the walls, the way you touch something you made with your own hands, and still can't quite believe is real. Priya came to the opening. James brought his wife. Liam stood beside me on the sidewalk outside the finished building and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at it, and then turned to me and said, "You made that." 2 words. I have not forgotten them. The distance from Kenwood Avenue did what distance does when you finally allow it to. It clarified things. I could see from 3 years out the precise shape of what my childhood had been. Not a series of misunderstandings, not a collection of oversights, not the inevitable friction of a blended family navigating something genuinely difficult. It was a system. Renata had built a system, and Vincent had maintained it through his silence. And I had survived it by making myself useful and undemanding and easy to overlook. I had therapy for the first time at 30. My therapist's name was Dr. Anand, a calm, precise woman with an office on the 4th floor of a building near Loring Park, whose primary talent seemed to be asking the single question that made everything else rearrange itself into sense. In our 3rd session, she said, "What would you have needed from your father that you never asked for?" I sat with that for a long time. "For him to notice," I said finally. "Not fix it, just notice." She wrote something in her notebook. And when he didn't, I decided it meant something was wrong with me. And now, I looked at the window. The light was gray, and even November light, the kind that makes everything look exactly as it is. Now I think it meant something was wrong with him, I said. And that's not the same thing at all. Vincent called occasionally. Not often, once every 6 or 8 weeks on a Sunday afternoon, the calls lasting between 7 and 12 minutes. We talked about my work, which he followed with a kind of careful interest that felt like an attempt at something, even if it arrived too late and too lightly to constitute repair. He mentioned Renata infrequently. He never mentioned the dinner party. He never mentioned the photograph. I never brought it up, not because I had forgiven it. I hadn't, not yet, maybe not ever in the way the word usually means, but because I had stopped needing him to acknowledge it. The acknowledgement I had spent 18 years waiting for, I had given myself. In Dr. Anand's office in my apartment in the North Loop, in the buildings I designed that stood in neighborhoods and served people and did not ask anyone's permission to exist. Renata never called, not once in 3 years. I noted the absence the way you note the absence of a sound you've grown accustomed to briefly and then not at all. Cassidy sent a text on my 30th birthday. Happy B-Day, hope you're well, no punctuation. Sent at 11:47 at night, which suggested it had been remembered late and dispatched out of some residual obligation. I read it, set my phone down, and went back to the dinner Liam had cooked for me. Salmon with roasted vegetables, a bottle of wine we'd been saving the kitchen warm with the particular light of a life that had been chosen carefully and was worth every choice. Preston sent nothing. I had expected nothing from Preston, and he had delivered precisely that with the consistency that had always been his most reliable quality. Liam moved in during the 2nd year. He brought his drafting table, 4 boxes of books organized in a system I never fully decoded, and a coffee ritual so specific and unhurried that the first Saturday morning I watched him perform it, I laughed out loud. He looked up without offense. The process matters, he said, entirely serious. I think about that sentence more than he probably intended me to. We talked about marriage, the way you talk about something that is already decided, and you're just working out the details, not a question of whether, but of when, and what it would look like, and whether we wanted something small or something that honored the people in our lives who deserved to be in the room. Grandpa Clifford deserved to be in the room. I called him every Sunday without fail, the same way he had called me through 4 years of university and 3 years of professional life, reliably, attentively, with the specific quality of a person who considers a phone call to be a serious commitment and honors it accordingly. He was 81 now. His voice had thinned slightly the way voices do, but his mind was precisely what it had always been. Sharp, patient, structured, the mind of a man who had spent 50 years thinking carefully about what things meant and what they were worth. He asked about every project. He asked about Liam with the particular warmth of someone who had watched me learn slowly and with difficulty to let another person be genuinely close. He asked about my work with Dr. Annan, which I had told him about because I trusted him with every true thing about my life. He never mentioned Renata, he never mentioned the notebook. But once near the end of a Sunday call in late autumn, he said something that stayed with me. I want you to know something, he said. Everything I've done, everything I've been doing, has been because you deserved someone in your corner. Not to fight your battles, just to make sure the ground was prepared. What ground? I asked. He paused. In his pauses, I had learned over the years, lived the things he was deciding how much to say. You'll understand soon, he said. I want to make sure a few more things are in order first. But soon. I didn't press him. There was something in his voice, settled, complete, the tone of a man who had finished a long piece of work and was satisfied with it, that told me the answer would arrive when it was ready. 3 weeks later, Liam took a call in our kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my desk reviewing drawings for the health center renovation in St. Paul. He appeared in the doorway of my home office. His face was careful in the way faces are when they are preparing to carry something heavy across a room. Sloane, he said. I looked up from my drawings. Your grandfather's attorney just called. I set my pencil down. The drawings were still spread across my desk. The health center renovation, the rooftop garden, the community room with the east-facing windows I had fought for because the people who would use it deserved morning light. Grandpa Clifford passed away 3 days ago, Liam said. Quietly, in his sleep, in the house on Kenwood. I sat very still. Outside the window, Minneapolis was doing what Minneapolis does in November gray and honest and unapologetic about it. A city that does not pretend the cold isn't coming, a city that prepares. His attorney wants to meet, Liam said. He said Clifford left instructions, specific ones. I looked at the window for a long moment. Then I picked up my pencil, capped it, and set it in the tray at the top of my drafting table. When, I asked, Garrett Howe's office was on the 14th floor of a sandstone building in downtown Minneapolis, 2 blocks from the courthouse where my grandfather had practiced law for the better part of 4 decades. The receptionist knew his name without being told. Not Clifford Merritt, the deceased, just Mr. Merritt, the way you say the name of someone whose absence the room has not yet fully processed. She brought us coffee without asking. She set it down gently. Liam had offered to wait in the lobby. I had said no. We sat side by side across from Garrett Howe's desk, a man in his late 50s, silver-haired with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular stillness of someone who has delivered news in this office many times, and has learned that the most important thing is to let the room breathe. On one side of the conference table, Vincent in a gray suit that looked like it had been pressed for the occasion. Beside him, Renata composed back straight, wearing the dark, structured jacket she reserved for situations that required the appearance of gravity. Cassidy sat to her mother's left arm's crossed expression, arranged into something approximating appropriate solemnity. Preston sat at the end, one ankle crossed over his knee, his face doing the particular thing it did when he was uncertain and was trying to look like he wasn't. On the other side, me and Liam, and one woman I hadn't met before, Vincent's aunt, Patricia Hale, 73 years old, who had driven up from Rochester because Garrett had asked her specifically to be present. She'd shaken my hand in the lobby with a grip that meant something. She had looked at me for a moment with the focused attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to see a particular face. "You look like your mother," she said quietly. I thanked her. I meant it. Garrett Howe opened the proceedings with the practiced efficiency of a man who respects other people's time and his own in equal measure. He laid the basic facts of the estate on the table, the house on Kenwood Avenue, assessed at $1,200,000. The investment accounts totaling $740,000. Several smaller items, a watch, a collection of first edition law texts, a piece of artwork that had hung in the study for as long as I could remember. Renata's posture did not change during this recitation, but her hands folded on the table in front of her tightened slightly. I noticed. I had spent 18 years learning to read the small movements. Before I addressed the distribution, Garrett said, "I need to read a specific provision Mr. Merritt included in the trust documents." He was very clear that this portion be read aloud in full before anything else. He opened the folder. He read, "I, Clifford James Merritt, being of sound mind and full legal capacity, hereby establish the following record for the benefit of my granddaughter, Sloane Merritt, and for the integrity of this proceeding." The room was completely still. Over a period of 15 years from 2008 through 2023, I have maintained a contemporaneous record of observations pertaining to the conduct of Renata Voss Merritt within the Merritt family household. This record was compiled not out of malice, but out of a duty I assumed on the night I first understood that no other adult in my granddaughter's life was going to perform it. Preston uncrossed his ankle. He set both feet on the floor. The record includes, but is not limited to, the following documented instances of financial misappropriation from the Caroline Merritt Educational Trust, totaling $36,100 over 7 years, withdrawn in increments, consistent with an intent to avoid scrutiny. Bank statements, correspondence, and trustee authorization records have been preserved and are attached as Exhibit A through Exhibit F. Renata's hands unfolded, then refolded, then went still in a way that was different from before, not composed still, but frozen still. The stillness of someone who has just heard a door close behind them. The record further documents a pattern of deliberate exclusion, psychological diminishment, and the systematic erasure of the memory of Caroline Merritt from the family household, conducted over a period of 18 years in the presence of a minor child. These observations are documented by date, location, and where possible the names of witnesses present. Vincent made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Low, involuntary, the sound of something landing. Garrett continued reading without pausing. "It is my considered belief as a man who practiced law for 41 years that the conduct described in this record rises to the level of actionable fraud with respect to the trust misappropriation and constitutes a pattern of emotional harm with respect to my granddaughter. I leave it to Sloane to determine what legal remedies, if any, she wishes to pursue. I have ensured only that she will have the documentation to pursue them if she chooses." Cassidy looked at her mother. Renata did not look back. The entirety of my estate, the property at Kenwood Avenue, all investment accounts, and all personal effects I leave to my granddaughter Sloane Merritt without condition and without reservation. It was always hers. I am only correcting the record. Garrett set the document down. He looked up. The room did not move. What happened next happened in the particular slow motion of moments that are too large for normal time. Preston stood up, then sat back down, then looked at his mother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not entitlement, but something younger and more unguarded. Confusion. The confusion of a person who has never seriously considered that the architecture of their life was built on someone else's loss and is confronting that possibility for the first time. Cassidy said, "Mom." Just that. One word. One. But the word contained a question. The question of what they had known and when, and what it meant that they were sitting in this room right now. Renata said nothing. She was looking at the folder on the table in front of Garrett, the folder that contained Exhibit A through Exhibit F. 15 years of her husband's father watching her. 15 years of dates and amounts and witness names compiled with the patience and precision of a man who had spent his life understanding exactly what evidence was worth. She had dismissed Clifford Merritt as a quiet old man who sat in corners and wrote things in a notebook. She had been right about all of it except the quiet part. Vincent turned to look at me. Across the table, across 18 years across, all the dinners and ceremonies and phone calls and silences, he looked at me. His face was open in a way I had not seen since I was 11 years old, sitting in a hospital room holding my mother's hand. He looked like a man who had just been shown a photograph of himself that he did not recognize. "I didn't know," he said, "about the trust. I didn't know." I held his gaze. "I know you didn't, Dad," I said. "That's the problem." He flinched, not away from me, into himself. The flinch of a man absorbing something true. Garrett Howe gave the room a moment. Then he set a second document on the table. Thinner a single page with a clean typeface that I recognized as the document Grandpa Clifford had described to me years ago in pieces without ever quite showing me the whole thing. "There is one additional provision," Garrett said. Mr. Merritt asked that I read this last. He picked up the page. "Sloane, if you're reading this, then things went the way I believe they would. I want you to know something that I should have said out loud more often and that I regret not saying with the frequency it deserved. You were never invisible to me, not for a single day, not when you were 11 years old sitting at the end of a table that should have had your name on it, not when you walked across a stage alone to collect an award that half that room should have been there to witness, not once." My throat tightened. Garrett kept reading. "I couldn't fight her battles for you. You needed to fight them yourself, and you did better than I could have asked. What I could do was make sure the ground was prepared. I hope I prepared it well. I hope you build something extraordinary on it. Knowing you, I'm certain you will. The house is just wood and walls, but it's your wood and your walls. It always was. I love you, Sloane, Grandpa Clifford." The room was completely silent. Outside the 14th floor window, Minneapolis spread itself out in every direction, gray and honest and entirely itself. A city that knows what it is. I sat with the letter for a long moment. Then Garrett Howe looked at me over his glasses and said very calmly, "Miss Merritt, your grandfather also asked that you be the one to decide what happens next. He said, and I'm quoting directly, 'She'll know what to do. She always has.'" I looked at the folder. Exhibit A through Exhibit F, $36,100. 15 years. Every dinner, every ceremony, every time Renata had looked at me and calculated the cost of my name in her mouth and decided it wasn't worth paying. All of it documented, all of it waiting. I reached across the table and picked up the folder. "I'll need a moment," I said. Garrett nodded. "Of course." I held the folder in both hands, and for the first time in 29 years I held everything. Garrett Howe booked a conference room at his firm for the following Thursday. Not the reading room, a different space larger with a rectangular table and chairs enough for everyone. He had suggested it. I had agreed. The meeting had one purpose, the terms I was prepared to offer, and the terms I was not. I spent the week between the reading and the meeting doing two things. The first was reviewing Exhibit A through Exhibit F, with Garrett line by line, the bank records, the withdrawal authorizations, The correspondence between Renata and the Trust's accounting firm correspondence that bore Vincent's signature, but whose language Garrett noted with careful neutrality, was inconsistent with the other documents Vincent had authored over the same period. The handwriting matched. The vocabulary didn't. Someone had drafted those letters and Vincent had signed them. Garrett did not speculate about what Vincent had or hadn't understood. He simply laid the documents in order and let them speak. The second thing I did was call Dr. Anand. We spoke for 90 minutes on a Tuesday evening. I told her everything, the reading the letter, the folder Vincent's face across the table. She listened the way she always listened, completely and without rushing toward an interpretation. At the end, she asked, "What do you want the outcome to be?" I had been thinking about that all week. "I don't want to spend the next year of my life in a courtroom," I said. "I don't want to give Renata another year of my attention. She's had enough of it." "And your father?" I was quiet for a moment. "I want him to reckon with it. Not for me, for himself. Because if he doesn't, nothing changes. And I'm done being the only one who changes." Dr. Anand said, "That sounds like a boundary, not a punishment." "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what it is." Thursday morning, the conference room on the 14th floor. The same people as before, arranged in roughly the same configuration, with the same quality of careful clothing and careful faces that people wear when they know the stakes have shifted and they are still determining how to stand in the new landscape. Except this time I sat at the head of the table. Garrett had asked me where I wanted to sit. I had chosen the head without hesitation. Not for the symbolism, though the symbolism was not lost on me, but because it was the accurate position. This was my meeting. The head of the table was where the person running the meeting sat. I set the folder on the table in front of me. I did not open it. I looked at each person in turn. Preston, who was watching me with an expression I had never seen from him before, wary, uncertain, stripped of the reflexive entitlement that had been his default setting for as long as I'd known him. Cassidy, who had her hands in her lap and was looking at the table. Vincent, whose eyes came to mine immediately and held them with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to stop looking away. And Renata? Renata was looking at the folder. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I spoke. "I'm not going to file criminal charges," I said. The room exhaled barely perceptibly, but I felt it. Not because what happened doesn't warrant it. The documentation is sufficient. Garrett has confirmed that. I kept my voice even. "I'm not filing because I'm not interested in spending the next 2 years of my life managing the legal calendar of people who have already taken enough from me." Renata's eyes moved from the folder to my face. "However," I said, "there are conditions, non-negotiable ones. And I want to be very clear about what non-negotiable means in this context. It means exactly what it says." I looked at Renata directly. "The house on Kenwood Avenue is mine. As of the date of the reading, it is mine in full, with no encumbrances. You have 60 days to vacate the property. Garrett will provide the formal notice today." Renata's jaw tightened. "That house is mine," I said. "My grandfather's documents are explicit. If you would like to contest the will, you are welcome to do so. Garrett can explain what the evidentiary record will look like in that proceeding." She stopped. I turned to Preston. "The car Renata purchased using the family accounts in 2019, Garrett has the records. You have 30 days to resolve that with him directly." Preston opened his mouth, closed it, nodded once. I turned to Cassidy. Cassidy looked up. "I don't have specific terms for you," I said. "You weren't the architect of this, but I want you to understand something." I held her eyes. Every trip, every tuition payment, every car and easel and studio class that came from accounts that should have been building my future, I know about all of it. Not because I'm keeping score, because I lived the other side of it. Cassidy looked down. Her throat moved. I turned to Vincent last. He was already looking at me. He had been looking at me since I sat down with the focused attention of a man who had spent too many years looking away and was trying, however late, to correct that. "Dad," I said, "I'm not going to tell you what to feel about this. That's your work, not mine." He nodded. "But I need one thing from you. Not an apology. I don't need an apology. I need you to see a therapist. A real one, not a pastor, not a friend. Someone qualified to help you understand how this happened and why you let it." I paused. "If you do that consistently, genuinely, I will have dinner with you. Once a month. We'll rebuild from there slowly if that's what we both decide we want. And if I don't, Vincent asked. His voice was quiet. Then we stay exactly where we are, I said. Civil, distant, and honest about why. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll make the call this week. I looked at him. I believe you, I said. Surprise me by following through. Renata spoke once more before the meeting ended. She had been silent for the better part of 40 minutes, an extraordinary silence for a woman whose primary instrument had always been language. The careful deployment of words in exactly the right order to produce exactly the desired effect. The silence itself was a kind of answer. But at the end, as Garrett was collecting documents and Preston was studying the table and Cassidy was still looking at her hands, Renata looked at me. You'll regret this, she said. The old version of that sentence delivered in the dining room of the Kenwood house, or at a family gathering, or through one of the soft-voiced phone calls she made to relatives when she needed the narrative adjusted, would have landed differently. It would have found the part of me that had spent 18 years wondering if she was right. That part was no longer available. I looked at her for a long moment. I've spent my whole life regretting the wrong things, I said. I'm done now. She held my eyes for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. It was the first time in 29 years that Renata Voss Merritt looked away first. I gathered my copy of the documents, picked up my bag, and pushed back my chair. Liam was waiting in the lobby. He stood up when he saw me come through the door, read my face the way he always read my face, quickly and accurately, and handed me my coat without a word. We walked out into the November afternoon together. The air was cold and direct and entirely honest. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel the need to brace against it.